my long-suffering listeners. This is Thersites the Historian, and tonight we're looking at Chapter 10 of George W. Bush's Campaign Manifesto, A Charge to Keep. I just realized that I said tonight because I'm giving away when I'm recording it. This will actually post on Sunday morning, but I'm actually recording it on Wednesday night. So that's a little inside baseball for you, since we're talking about a president who famously owned a baseball team. But we're not actually going to cover the chapter where he talks about baseball because it looked boring as shit. Instead, we're going to cover a chapter entitled The Big 4-0. This is effectively George W. Bush's attempt to say that while his faith is important to him and made him a better person, he didn't need his faith to cure his alcoholism because he was never actually an alcoholic. What he's trying to argue in this chapter is effectively that as he got older, it became harder to recover from hangovers, and he just decided that it would be best to just stop drinking, and it was just a decision he made along the way. He never had a problem really, and people blew this out of proportion and made up the problem. He's claiming that he never at any point in his life struggled with alcohol. I think that his arrest record for a DUI or two would beg to differ. At any rate, I'm sure that there are people who have massively exaggerated his alcoholism, but here he's clearly trying to paper over it in a way that's totally weird and disingenuous. I almost wanted to do chapters 8 and 9 before doing this one because, well, they come first, and they also address this issue of faith that George W. Bush talks so much about. But I felt like I would do this one first because it addresses something that people know about Bush, and the chapter is much shorter at 8 pages than the 15 and 22 pages that chapters 8 and 9 have respectively. And I just didn't feel like doing a super long video tonight since it's already 2 in the morning. So let's look at the Big 4-0 and see George W. Bush's weak age-based defense against his charge of alcoholism. Much, probably too much, has been made of my 40th year. Despite the barbs some political opponents like to toss, I don't believe life begins at 40. That seems like a very odd thing to have to say. It sounds like something that Beto O'Rourke would say. Beto, of course, is usually accused of being frivolous, and if you look at his biography, he really only grew up within the last several years. He was kind of a man-child, and much the same could be said of Bush, although he covered it up quite a bit better, at least early on. I mean, Bush would hold official positions even if those positions were largely a joke. And as I've discussed in previous chapters, his business career and his political connections owe almost entirely to his last name. If he were not named Bush and if he had not been born without money, he would have retired as an assistant manager from Taco Bell. Mine certainly didn't. Long before I turned 40, I went to school, got an education, served in the National Guard, earned a graduate degree, got married, had children, met a payroll, raised and risked money in the oil business, campaigned for office. So, yeah, he did all those things, but it wouldn't be like a normal person without the advantages he had doing those things. Most people technically have accomplished less before 40 than Bush, but they also have way fewer opportunities. And if you know anything about his background academically, you know that the only reason he ever got anywhere near an Ivy League school is because of his parentage and his wealth. I was active in my community. I coached Little League. I taught Sunday school. I raised money for my church, and I led a United Way campaign. Once again, very choppy, short sentences. That is a Bush hallmark. But there are turning points in life, and one of mine was quitting drinking, which I did shortly after my 40th birthday. So I like how he sets up this dramatic thing as if this is just a decision he made, like a kind of birthday resolution, and it was just that he hit this milestone of age and he thought this would be a good way to stay healthy after 40. And that's basically the kind of setup that we'll see here. But it doesn't make sense unless he actually had a problem with drinking in moderation, which seems to be the case. And I actually know someone who does struggle with alcohol in that sense, where he can go months without drinking and be fine, but if he starts drinking, he'll become an animal and just like start consuming anything with alcohol. I imagine that's sort of maybe what George W. Bush experienced, though probably not quite as dramatic. Otherwise, there would be some stories. I mean, the guy I know once actually tried to parkour out of a third-story window when he was drunk. He fell 3 stories and only dislocated his shoulder. Anyway, that's its own story, and we don't need to get into that. I don't think George W. Bush did anything quite that interesting. But maybe Beto might have. I mean, Beto, after all, was into skateboarding and, you know, punk rock and stuff like that. So maybe someone needs to ask Beto about his craziest drunk or high night, and maybe that'll even boost his poll numbers. Who knows? I mean, Beto has to do something interesting, or otherwise he should just drop out of the race, because he's kind of taking up space on the stage that would be better served by someone who actually has a brain. But we're not talking about Beto. We're talking about Beto's inspiration of sorts, like the other guy from Texas who was kind of an irresponsible man-child who sought power beyond his ability to control. My wife and friends later joked that, notoriously frugal, I quit after seeing the bar bill. Several of us turned 40 that year, and we gathered in Colorado Springs on the weekend of Don Evans' birthday for a collective celebration. Don and Susie were there, and Joe and Jan O'Neill, Laura, and our friend Penny Sawyer. Once again, if you didn't know, George W. Bush is a man who has many, many friends. Very popular, that George, and quite likable. You should like him too, and vote for him. My brother Neil drove down from Denver to join us, and we had a big time at a dinner and at the Broadmoor Hotel. We had a big time? That seems like a sentence a third grader would use, and that's being generous. What's a big time? I had a big time. I've heard of a good time, but I think, yeah, big time is clearly some sort of typographical error on his part. People later asked whether something special happened, some incident, some argument or accident that turned the tide, but no. I just drank too much and woke up with a hangover. I got out of bed and went for my usual run. For the last 14 years, I had run at least 3 miles almost every day. This run was different. I felt worse than usual, and about halfway through I decided I would drink no more. I came back to the hotel room and I told Laura I was through. That just does not pass the bullshit test. It sounds like complete horseshit. He's basically arguing like, yeah, I eventually chose running and health over drinking, but if you drank in moderation and you knew how to stop before you got wasted, you would not need to quit drinking. And actually, some amount of alcohol can be a part of a healthy diet and have benefits for you. So this is not a virtuous thing to stop drinking just because you can't handle it. I mean, it's virtuous in the sense that if you can't handle it, you shouldn't drink. I'll give you that. And I wish he would just come clean about that. I would respect him way more if he said, yes, I cannot take alcohol, therefore I don't drink. It would show that he had self-awareness. It would show that he had some degree of character because there was something that he had struggled with that he actually managed to overcome. It would actually be a struggle that he surmounted. And I think later, after this book, he did more or less fess up about all this, at least indirectly, but here he's trying to lie straight up about this whole thing. I'm quitting drinking, I told her, then never said much else about it. I'm not sure she believed me at first. So if she didn't believe him, that does imply that he had an issue. Because if he didn't have an issue with drinking, and if this wasn't something that kept happening over and over, she would think, oh, well, this thing that's a tiny part of his life that's more or less insignificant will not be easy to overcome. It would be like if he had a bad experience with a certain brand of macaroni and cheese, and he said, Laura, we're never buying Kraft again, right? Yeah, that would be believable. But if there's something that he does every single day of his life, and then he just says, yeah, I'm done with that, then of course she's going to be skeptical, or she's going to think that this is just the beginning of a much longer process of quitting. He gives the game away right from the outset. But I can be pretty stubborn with myself. I've always been a disciplined person. Even when I was drinking, I drank only after work at night, never during the day. But that pretty much could be said of almost every alcoholic who's able to hold down a job. That's not unusual. Most people are not so far gone that they have to drink during the day while they're at work. They don't have a flask in their office. I mean, unless you worked in an ad agency in the 60s where that kind of behavior is kind of par for the course. But for the most part, you can't drink at work. That's kind of understood. This is not a revolutionary thing, and it doesn't absolve him of having a drinking issue just because he was able to keep his shit together to some minimal level. Although, to be fair, he would not have been fired from any of these jobs because, the magical last name and whatnot. I always worked hard, except in school. I met my responsibilities as a husband, father, and employer. But your responsibilities as an employer were showing your name and using that name to open doors for other people. So that's not too fucking hard to do, whether you're drunk, sober, or buzzed. It really isn't. My friends laugh about the image of me as a party animal, an image they think is vastly overblown. Well, yeah, your friends support you for president. They're not going to expose you. But this is all part of this 90s bullshit culture war, virtue signaling stuff that was going on at the time, where Bill Clinton was like, I tried marijuana, but I did not inhale, so it doesn't count. I'm not a drug addict or a reefer head or a bad person. Look, if you say smoked a joint and you failed to inhale, that means that you're incompetent at smoking weed. That is a mark against you. If you're going to smoke weed, smoke weed. If you're going to drink, drink in moderation, unless you want to get drunk, in which case you do get drunk. If you behave like an asshole and get yourself in trouble when you get drunk, don't get drunk. I feel like this is simple, common sense shit. And it's amazing to me to think that adults who were about my age now at the time would sit there and seriously pretend that they themselves had never inhaled marijuana or gone out drinking with their friends, and they would sit there and wag their fingers at these candidates as if this is something that they don't understand, like some behavior that is foreign to them or bizarre in some way. I mean, I guess to be fair, most of the public didn't really care that much, but there was still this finger-wagging tabloidy bullshit going on about people engaging in casual drinking or sex or whatever in the 90s, and it's so bizarre and foreign to me now. I mean, at the time, I guess I thought that, oh no, that is bad, but I was a kid. I didn't know better. The fact that there were adults who looked at that and engaged in finger wagging when they themselves most likely did some or all of these behaviors in their spare time is astounding. Yeah, I know some people have 90s nostalgia. I personally don't. I mean, I love the video games and some of the movies and things from back then, but glad it's over. We're better off now, I think, at least in terms of where our headspace is when it comes to what I'd call common sense, or I guess what you could even call social issues. Let's get through this bullshit. I'm gonna quit going off on tangents. It all started when a reporter asked why I quit drinking. Because I thought I was drinking too much, I frankly replied. I set off another round of rumors when I was asked to itemize my youthful misdeeds. I famously and perhaps foolishly said, when I was young and irresponsible, I sometimes behaved young and irresponsibly. I imagine also, though, that him having a DUI and there being a video of him drunk at a wedding talking about how he wouldn't trust people who don't drink probably also played a role. I'm just going to throw that out there, like evidence. Evidence might have played a role. Just saying. I thought it was a humorous way to acknowledge that I am not perfect, that as a young man I did some things I'm not particularly proud of today. If this were actually a true account of what had happened, I would actually be completely on Bush's side on this. But the thing is, if you go and get a DUI, I mean, maybe you just made a mistake and you're not actually that serious of a drinker, and the problem was you have a shit tolerance. I don't know. But for the most part, if you get a DUI, that's a pretty hard piece of evidence to refute if someone says you used to have a problem with alcohol. I'm still amazed by the rumor mongering set off by that offhand remark, all apparently spawned by my refusal to itemize a laundry list of things I wish I hadn't done. Perhaps a better way to put it is to say I engaged in some of the excesses of youth of my time. I like that clarification, as if the youths of the 90s weren't engaged in drinking or, you know, smoking weed or whatever. Or as if people, say, in the 50s and before didn't engage in such things, as if all this started just in the 60s and 70s and it was confined to this moment of degeneracy. Things I wouldn't have wanted my mother to know then, but that she would probably laugh about now that I've survived them. Things I don't want my daughters to do, yet worry they probably will. I hope they did. Before age and maturity help counter the sense of invincibility that comes with being young and the life of the party. But most people aren't the life of the party. That's a very particular experience for people who are very extroverted. So most people don't have that experience. And also, most people who drink don't have a problem with alcohol, unlike you, George. Many reporters who ask me about this do not approve of my reluctance to itemize misbehavior. They worship at the altar of public confession, demanding that candidates tell all. They want to conduct a public strip search, throwing out a question here and a rumor there, hoping it will bear another layer. So he's attacking the press in an explicit way and saying that they suck at their job and that they're being tabloidy. And he's not wrong. But what's really interesting to me is that now that there is the Trump hysteria, many people pretend like Trump is the first and only politician in American history who has taken a big dump on the media. And it's just not the case. This was a Republican tactic in Bush's day. Bush himself was once overheard on a mic when he thought he wasn't mic'd up, talking about some random reporter from the New York Times and characterizing the guy as a major league asshole. And he also bullied the media into having favorable coverage of the Iraq War by basically saying that anyone who wasn't with him was unpatriotic. So yeah, Bush did bully the press, and he also attacked the competency of the press when he wanted to, or when it was advantageous. And the thing is, Bush also was trying to run a likability campaign in 2000, so he might pretend that he doesn't want the press looking into his personal life, but he was eager to talk about his faith and things that he had done, and just getting exposed in a way that would show him as being more approachable than Al Gore, who is a bit of a cold fish. So this is all bullshit. I think they forget that children are watching, including my own. I believe parents who choose to recount their misadventures run a great risk that their children will imitate them. I also think some parents of my generation make the mistake of telling their children too much, of trying to be friends rather than parents and examples. This is classic misdirection. Sure, the media should focus on substance, but let's face it, what difference was there between Bush and Gore, at least in the campaign trail? You can make all the arguments you want about how they would be different as president, how Gore would have been a much more responsible and competent manager, but they mostly just would say in the debates, I agree with my opponent. Let me just add this trivial detail. That's how those debates flowed. There was very little debate in those debates. So yeah, he's just doing moralizing garbage here about our American values and the press being indecent. So he's trying to flip it all on them. So it's fairly politically astute, I think. So if this were the only thing you knew about the alcohol issue, you might be willing to say, yeah, Bush is a good guy. He didn't have a problem. It's just the media making this up to get headlines. I was going to say views or clicks, but this was 2000, and I don't think that was yet the case. I have chosen a different path. I don't want my own daughters or any other young people to imitate anything foolish I once did or use me as an excuse for misbehavior. I believe leaders have a responsibility to send a clear message to our children. Don't abuse alcohol. Don't use drugs. Don't have a baby out of wedlock. Make smart and healthy choices. So, low-key, the way that he wrote this was inept because he basically just claimed that he has an out-of-wedlock child. If you think about it. And he also added drugs to that list. Because he's talking about why he won't talk about his misdeeds, but now he's going back and talking about these other things that he has never been accused of. So if someone were being a real pedant, they could take him to town over that. And also, I like how he throws in don't have a baby out of wedlock is something you should never tell your children about from your youth, because most likely that would be the child in question. the child you're teaching. So you don't tell them that they were born out of wedlock. You just lie to them about their origins. You know, yeah, you had a mom or dad, but they died climbing mountains when you were 6 months old. You know, I don't know how to tell you. And so, much to the disappointment of some of the purveyors of gossip and innuendo, I will not play the game of political gotcha. Sure, I will not respond to the rumor du jour. I have told people what they need to know about me. I have made mistakes, and I have learned from them. I have been a devoted dad and a loyal husband, and when I took an oath to become the governor of Texas, I swore to uphold not only the laws of my state, but also the dignity and integrity of the office. I have done so. And should I be fortunate enough to be elected President of the United States, I will uphold the dignity and high honor of that high office too. So help me God. And by the dignity and high honor of the office, he means that he will defend his donors and their economic interest, of course. But really, rhetorically, what he's trying to do is draw a contrast without saying anything to Bill Clinton being accused of getting a blowjob in the Oval Office. He's trying to portray himself as someone who is chaste, Christian, and moral, unlike the degenerate who's in the White House right now. That's really what's going on here. It's a subtle jab at Bill Clinton. I hope my stand will help purge the system of its relentless quest for scandal and sensation. I worry that when gossip spreads on the internet is repeated on the front page of respected newspapers, we are undermining our American democracy. The political process is only as good as the people who are willing to enter it. Too many good people tell me they would never seek office because they would never subject themselves to the scrutiny of the public strip search. There's deep, deep irony to him using the phrasing of a public strip search, since that was a part of one of his more well-known pieces of legislation, the Patriot Act. But also, I like how he's trying to pretend like it's this one problem, the media digging too deeply, that is causing good people not to run for office. Because he is clearly benefiting from and responding to Bill Clinton's problems in office. He was explicitly running as a moral candidate who will restore the dignity of the office. Unless someone in some way sullies that dignity, you can't run on something so fucking stupid. You'd have to run on, say, policy. You'd have to run on your resume. You'd have to run on something real. He's definitely not angry about this situation. He's capitalizing on it. I have talked about my marriage and my decision to quit drinking because those speak to the way I have conducted my life as a mature adult. I am a person who enjoys life, and for years I enjoyed having a few drinks. But gradually, drinking began to compete with my energy. I'd be a step slower getting up. My daily run seemed harder after a few too many drinks the night before. So again, if you were just having a little bit of alcohol on appropriate occasions, this would not be a problem. Unless you're drinking too much and you have a problem with self-control, this would not be happening. I mean, do I have to spell this out anymore? Like, does he not think that people who read this book, maybe he thought that he was writing to an audience of all people who had never tasted a sip of alcohol before, and that they would be too stupid to know how alcohol affects the human body. I mean, what in the hell was he thinking here? Drinking also magnified aspects of my personality that probably don't need to be larger than they already are. Maybe more funny, more charming, I thought, more irrepressible. Also, according to my wife, somewhat boring and repetitive. That sounds like pretty much everybody drunk, though. At least, unless they're piss drunk. This is not all that interesting or unique, and if this were true, this would not be a problem, really. What may have been funny in moderation was not so funny in exaggeration. Again, you're saying you never had a problem, and now you're saying it was too much. It's self-contradictory. This is a really shitty attempt to paper over a problem you should just confess to. since it's already known, and then talk about how you overcame it and how that's a testament to your character. But instead, he's just trying to deny it, but in the most inept way imaginable. I don't want to leave a mistaken impression of late nights or wild parties. The truth is, when we had a get-together, I was usually the first to arrive and the first one out the door. 9 o'clock and I'm gone. I have never been one to stay up late. So, staying up late makes you a bad person? Well, I guess it's a good thing he doesn't watch this channel, because then he'd know I'm recording at 2 a.m. And I guess because I'm up this late recording, I must be a terrible person. I must be one of those degenerates, because a good person goes to bed by 9 o'clock every night. There were a few big parties. The Midland Country Club sponsored a 3-day member-guest golf tournament called the Wild Scatter that advertised 72 hours of open bar. It was renowned as one of the best parties of the year, and people came from across the country to participate. I played some golf and attended the events, one of them a costume party. My friends alleged I showed up in a Nixon mask one year, and that another time I dressed up as Mahatma Gandhi in a toga that looked like a diaper by the end of the night. So he doesn't remember making fairly involved costumes or purchases, and he didn't have the costume later to confirm that this is the case. That's weird. And that implies that he was blackout drunk. And normally you don't get blackout drunk unless you go way over the line, but he's talking about, yeah, I used to just have a few drinks. And it sounds like Jim Leahy trying to talk about how he just had a couple drinky poos, Randy. Note to Jay Leno and other comedians who have had so much fun with the George Bush dance naked on a bar rumor, it's not true. The toga costume is about as close as you're going to get. I didn't know about that rumor, but even if it was true, you could just confess to it. People do dumb shit sometimes when they're drunk. It's better than lying about it if it was true. I mean, maybe it's not true, I don't know. Who cares? I didn't advertise my decision to stop or make a big deal out of quitting. My friends just gradually noticed I was no longer drinking at our gatherings. Outwardly, nothing changed. Laura and I still went to parties and dinners with our friends. I didn't change habits or do anything different to help me quit. But inwardly, I felt different. I had more time to read. I mean, I didn't, of course, read because I'm not a nerd, but I had more time, in theory, to read books. I had more energy. I became a better listener, and not such an incessant talker. Quitting drinking made me more focused and more disciplined. I now say it is one of the best things I have ever done. And now for our mandatory tribute to Billy Graham and other megachurch guys who are highly influential. And this part takes the incoherence of this argument he's trying to make to a new level, because he talks about how all these people inspired him to be a better person, but he never specifies in what way. What was the problem with him that it needed to be fixed? He talks about this in such an abstract, ungrounded way that you might think he would have to have had a problem to be improved in this way. But he's trying to deny that he had any problems, but he was yet somehow spiritually uplifted by these inspirational leaders. So this part does not add up. We'll go through it. Actually, the seeds of my decision had been planted the year before by the Reverend Billy Graham. He visited my family for a summer weekend in Maine. I saw him preach at the small summer church, St. Anne's by the Sea. We all had lunch on the patio overlooking the ocean. One evening, my dad asked Billy to answer questions from a big group of family gathered for the weekend. He sat by the fire and talked, and what he said sparked a change in my heart. I don't remember the exact words. It was more the power of his example. The Lord was so clearly reflected in his gentle and loving demeanor. The next day we walked and talked at Walker's Point, and I knew I was in the presence of a great man. He was like a magnet. I felt drawn to seek something different. He didn't lecture or admonish. He shared warmth and concern. Billy Graham didn't make you feel guilty. He made you feel loved. This sounds like a political model for, say, someone who's trying to sell really shit policy and then trying to come off as compassionate. Maybe if someone was trying to sell you a right-wing plan that would fuck over poor people, but then pretends to have a lot of concern for that same demographic, and then labeled themselves as, say, a compassionate conservative, would that be about right? Is that about what we're talking about with Billy Graham? Because that's kind of the impression I'm getting, that Bush saw this example of someone who isn't really holy in any meaningful way, but, you know, maybe to a dumb person comes off that way. So maybe if you can just imitate the kind of easygoing mannerisms of someone who seems happy and well-adjusted, you can convince people to give you money and believe whatever bullshit comes out of your mouth. That seems like the lesson that's coming out of this for Bush. Over the course of that weekend, Reverend Graham planted a mustard seed in my soul, a seed that grew over the next year. He led me to the path, and I began walking. Earlier, Bush said that life does not begin at 40, but here he's kind of contradicting that. Because if a new seed is sprouting, this means that he's being reborn or reshaped, and that there's a fundamental shift in his life. And it was the beginning of a change in my life. I had always been a religious person, had regularly attended church, even taught Sunday school, and served as an altar boy. But that weekend, my faith took on new meaning. It was the beginning of a new walk where I would recommit my heart to Jesus Christ. So this is appealing to born-again Christians. And now things are about to get cringy as fuck. I was humbled to learn that God sent his Son to die for a sinner like me. I was comforted to know that through the Son I could find God's amazing grace, a grace that crosses every border, every barrier, and is open to everyone. Through the love of Christ's life, I could understand the life-changing powers of faith. When I returned to Midland, I began reading the Bible regularly. Don Evans talked me into joining him and another friend, Don Jones, at a men's community Bible study. Apparently all men named Don are Christian. The group had first assembled the year before, in the spring of 1984, at the beginning of the downturn in the energy industry. Midland was hurting. A lot of people were looking for comfort and strength and direction. A couple of men started the Bible study as a support group, and it grew. By the time I began attending in the fall of 1985, almost 120 men would gather. We met in small discussion groups of 10 or 12, then joined the larger group for full meetings. Don Jones picked me up every week for the meetings. I remember looking forward to them. My interest in reading the Bible grew stronger and stronger, and the words became clearer and more meaningful. I think what he's trying to say is that he expanded his vocabulary into the middle school range finally. We studied Acts, the story of the apostles building the Christian church, and the next year, the Gospel of Luke. So, if you know anything about the New Testament, you know that Luke Acts is written as a unit by the same author, but that Luke is written first, and chronologically that story takes place first. Why would you read Acts and then Luke? Who was running this group? I mean, that's just ass backwards. That's... what? The preparation for each meeting took several hours, reading the scripture passages and thinking through responses to discussion questions. I took it seriously with my usual touch of humor. Don remembers a time after watching a video on Luke's description of John the Baptist when the speaker asked the class to define a prophet. He was serious, but I couldn't resist. A prophet is when revenues exceed expenses, and no one has seen one around here since Elijah, I answered. Once a speaker was joking about his upbringing and said, "It's not easy being a PK, i.e. a preacher's kid. You ought to try being a VPK, a vice president's kid," was my instant comeback. I like how he never clarifies that anyone laughed at these jokes. Maybe people just sat there and didn't say anything. If you've ever been in the South, and maybe this is true of like the oil men, I don't know, but I know with like blue collar men in the South, they're not very talkative or expressive. So it is possible that Bush was making these jokes and people were just looking down at their feet, not saying anything, and then talking about him later behind his back. I think depending on what the demographics of these meetings were, whether these were just all oil men or what, I don't know. But Yeah, because I mean, I guess, business people in the South are very voluble, so they'd probably be yapping it up. But if there were any like blue collar people there, they were just sitting there looking down, trying to pretend they didn't hear it, and they most likely didn't find it funny at all. Laura and I were active members of the First Methodist Church of Midland, and we participated in many family programs, including James Dobson's Focus on the Family series on raising children. James Dobson's Focus on the Family, just for those of you who don't know, is a very right-wing group, and this group has been heavily involved in a lot of social issues in recent years. They tend to be on the right-wing side of literally everything. So here Bush is basically virtue signaling to the larger evangelical community that he's one of them, and that he's, anti-gay. That wasn't quite really a thing yet. No one cared too much in 2000 about gay marriage. But this did set him up to run against gay marriage in 2004, and that he would, mostly the main point is that he was anti-abortion. That's really what mattered the most. And by mentioning James Dobson, that basically plants a flag if he was all into this. As I studied and learned, Scripture took on greater meaning, and I gained confidence and understanding in my faith. I read the Bible regularly. Don Evans gave me the 1-year Bible, a Bible divided into 365 daily readings, each one including a section from the New Testament, the Old Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs. I read through that Bible every other year. So apparently he didn't have that much extra time for reading after he stopped drinking, because the book is designed to be read in a year, but it takes him 2. And yeah, also it doesn't sound like this would be a comprehensive or very useful way to read the Bible, because you need kind of like context when you're reading a long narrative text. Context helps a lot when you're reading any book, actually. Just reading random passages will not give you much of a sense of what you're looking at. So, I'm not into any faith communities at all. I'm an atheist, but I feel like it's weird because I'm having to explain to someone who claims to be a hardcore Christian how you read the Bible like a normal fucking person. It seems like a very odd conversation to be having. During the years in between, I picked different chapters to study at different times. I have also learned the power of prayer. I pray for guidance. I do not pray for earthly things, but for heavenly things, for wisdom and patience and understanding. That is sickening. And I seriously doubt that that is the case. My faith gives me focus and perspective. It teaches humility. But I also recognize that faith can be misinterpreted in the political process. Faith is an important part of my life. I believe it is important to live my faith, not flaunt it. And that's why he wrote a whole chapter talking about what a good Christian he is. Actually, this comes up over and over in this book, now I think about it. And it wasn't subtle in his campaign at all. He didn't have that much to campaign on, so he talked a lot about Jesus. So if that's not flaunting your faith, I really don't know what is. America is a great country because of our religious freedoms. So I guess that's the only reason that we're a great country. I mean, religious freedom is definitely a big reason why America has stuff going for it, but that's not the only reason, and it's not the core reason, certainly. It is important for any leader to respect the faith of others. Agreed. That point was driven home when Laura and I visited Israel in 1998. We had traveled to Rome to spend Thanksgiving with our daughter, who was attending a school program there, and spent 3 days in Israel on the way home. So basically, Bush made a pilgrimage to Rome and Jerusalem so that way he could be the new Constantine. Yeah, I guess. I feel like it's weird that he would work this in because nothing really happens in this story. This is an anecdote that goes fucking nowhere. It was an incredible experience. I remember waking up at the Jerusalem Hilton. Remember when I told you he was rich? If you're not rich, you don't stay at the Hilton. And opening the curtains and seeing the old city before us, the Jerusalem stone glowing gold. We visited the Western Wall and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And we went to the Sea of Galilee and stood atop the hill where Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. It was an overwhelming feeling to stand in the spot where the most famous speech in the history of the world was delivered, the spot where Jesus outlined the character and conduct of the believer and gave his disciples in the world the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, and the Lord's Prayer. The only problem with the Sermon on the Mount, historically, I think it only occurs in one of the 4 Gospels. So, yeah, it can't be said to have been the most famous speech in the history of the world, since 3 of the 4 Gospel writers, who all lived in the late 1st century, apparently hadn't heard of it. I don't know what the most famous speech in history would be, but I don't think it would be that one. Our delegation included 4 Gentile governors, 1 Methodist, 2 Catholics, and a Mormon, and several Jewish American friends. See, he's religiously tolerant in addition to having a lot of friends. He has friends from different faiths. Isn't he a great guy? Isn't this incredible? Someone suggested we read Scripture. I chose to read Amazing Grace, my favorite hymn. Yeah, what a generic choice. I'm sure that if this guy's really deep into religion the way he claims that he is and goes to Bible study, wouldn't he have found one that's a little off the beaten path, something that he could reveal to other people who are into Christianity that would help inspire them, something that they haven't heard before, that they don't hear often? I mean, Amazing Grace. Come on. Yeah, be a little creative, George. This is sad. It's like when Obama tried to claim his favorite beer is Budweiser. I mean, dude, you're rich and you know what arugula is. If you know that arugula is better than regular lettuce, surely you know that there are other options when it comes to beer that are better than Budweiser. I'm just not buying it. Our delegation included 4 Gentile governors. Oh wait, we already read that. Oh yeah, I forgot. Gentile governors, that's funny. Alright, later that night we all gathered at a restaurant in Tel Aviv for dinner before we boarded our middle-of-the-night flight back to America. We talked about the wonderful experiences and thanked the guides and government officials who had introduced us to their country. So I like how he got the guided tour, and I'm sure that no one approached him about the suffering of the Palestinians or any of the problems that actually exist in Israel. And toward the end of the meal, one of our friends rose to share a story, to tell us how he, a Gentile, and his friend, a Jew, had, unbeknownst to the rest of us, walked down to the Sea of Galilee, joined hands underwater, and prayed together on bended knee. This is sickening pandering to religious people. I mean, why write all of this? What's the purpose of this? I mean, this sort of crosses the border between being really in the faith and being a borderline fanatic. I mean, it'd be at this point in reading this, if my mind was undecided as a voter, that I might think that Bush is a little loony and that maybe he loves Jesus a little too much. Then out of his mouth came a hymn he had known as a child, a hymn he hadn't thought about in years. He got every word right. Now is the time approaching, by prophets long foretold, when all shall dwell together, one shepherd and one fold. Now Jew and Gentile meeting, from many a distant shore, around an altar kneeling, one common Lord adore. I actually have no idea what that's supposed to sound like. I just made that up. Hopefully that wasn't too cringeworthy and terrible when I tried to sing that. I don't know how to sing fucking at all. And last line, faith changes lives. I know, because faith has changed mine. But apparently you didn't need to have your life changed because you just decided to quit drinking on the morning after your 40th birthday. You just were like, I'm done because I have willpower and I have determination. So there's a larger contradiction at play with this whole chapter, and I think this is probably the 5th or 23rd time I've had to point out a contradiction here. George W. Bush wants to claim the mantle of being a born-again evangelical Christian because that was really trendy in the 80s and the 90s and throughout the early 2000s. At the same time, though, he wants us to believe that while faith has made him a better person, he was already a great person and didn't actually need it. If he just cut down or eliminated alcohol because it drained his energy and body, and he wasn't able to run quite as well when he had a hangover, which no shit. Yeah, and he claims like his drunken antics are less cute at 40 than 20. Okay, sure. So drink less. If you're able to drink less, you can avoid that problem. But what concrete benefit has Bush derived from his faith if he didn't require faith to quit drinking? What is he? What did he learn? And also, aside from being around Graham's holy presence and seeing some cool walls in Jerusalem, and then meeting some friends and talking about Jesus, like, what did he actually learn? What did he improve about himself? What insight did he glean, at least? Like, what new way does he see the world that he wouldn't have seen it otherwise? This sounds like a frat boy in awe of something profound that always that he thinks is profound, but that he clearly doesn't understand at all. This sounds like when, if you're teaching a college class and you read a paper by someone who clearly doesn't really know much, but they try to appeal to your love of the subject by just talking about how great it is. That's what it comes off to me. That's how I read this. And also with this Bible group, the whole thing is highly suspect because he's talking about it being all these sort of oilmen who are on hard times, and that's how it originated. So clearly, while they did read the Bible or whatever, the pace, the slow, turgid pace that they make it through makes me think that this was really just a group about businessmen meeting each other and power brokers making deals. That's really the heart of what's going on. And for Bush, I mean, we know he's a social guy. He admits it on several occasions. He can't help himself but to name someone as a friend any chance he gets. He wanted to make new friends. That was more important to him than all of this reading the Bible shit, and that's okay. But pretending that this was like some great spiritual journey for him because he got together with other businessmen in the same industry and read the Bible, I don't buy it. And yeah, the trip to Jerusalem also sounds a lot more touristy than faith-based. And if he's going there as a governor with other governors, this is a state visit. Regardless of what his faith was like or if he had any faith to begin with, he would have probably still gone on the trip. He wanted to raise his national profile and get to know some people who were well connected, his peers as governors. Nothing in this chapter is all that convincing. So I don't know what he was hoping to accomplish here other than to really suck off evangelicals. I guess he accomplished that, and I guess they voted for him, so maybe he knows something that I don't. Anyway, this has been Thersites the Historian. Next time, when we resume this series, we will be looking at Chapter 8, which will be very long and very painful.